For decades, the world has celebrated the friendship and the friction between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. But behind that spotlight was another story, quieter, deeper, and far more mysterious. For years, fans have wondered, how did Paul really feel about George Harrison, the Quiet Beatle who shaped his music and changed his life forever? Keep watching as now, after years of silence, Paul McCartney finally opens up, revealing the truth about their bond, the tensions, and the heartbreaking final moments they shared. But before everything began, there was a boy from Liverpool with a love for music that would change the world. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England. His father, James, known to most as Jim, worked as a cotton salesman but had a deep passion for music. A self-taught musician, Jim could play the trumpet and piano and even led his own local band, Jim Mack's Jazz Band. Paul's mother, Mary, was a nurse and the family's steady provider. Her income kept the household afloat, allowing them to live modestly but comfortably. Paul and his younger brother, Michael, grew up surrounded by music. Their father often played songs around the house and tried to teach Paul the piano, though Paul showed little interest at first. He preferred listening to the popular tunes of the day, absorbing melodies rather than practicing them. Everything changed when Paul was 14. His mother, Mary, died of breast cancer, a loss that left a lasting mark on him. Years later, he would say that her memory inspired much of his music. His timeless song, Let It Be, came from a dream he had after her death, in which she appeared to him and gently told him to let it be. After her passing, music became Paul's refuge. His father bought him a cheap guitar, and though he struggled at first, being left-handed, he eventually taught himself to play by restringing it. He practiced relentlessly, performing popular songs and slowly finding his own rhythm. In 1957, fate stepped in. Paul met John Lennon at a church event where John was performing with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen. Impressed by John's energy and wit, Paul struck up a conversation after the show. The two connected immediately, sharing a love for songwriting and rock and roll. John soon invited Paul to join his band, a decision that would ignite one of the most iconic musical partnerships in history. Together, inspired by legends like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, they spent endless hours writing, playing, and perfecting their sound. Those early days laid the groundwork for what would become the Beatles. Though Paul attended the Liverpool Institute, academics never truly held his interest. His heart was in music. By the early 1960s, he was performing in clubs with fellow musicians, dreaming of something bigger. That dream became reality when manager Brian Epstein discovered the group and helped them land a record deal with EMI's Parlophone label. From that moment on, the Beatles were born, and modern music would never be the same. By the time the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1968, Paul McCartney had become the group's creative driving force, shaping many of their musical and film projects. His songs, And I Love Her Yesterday, Eleanor Rigby, and Blackbird, remain among the most covered in history. Though known as the band's bassist, Paul often played keyboards, guitar, and drums on recordings. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, he launched his solo career with McCartney and soon formed Wings with his wife Linda and Denny Laine. Under his leadership, Wings became one of the biggest bands of the 1970s, producing hits like My Love, Band on the Run, Listen to What the Man Said, and Silly Love Songs. In the following decades, Paul continued to top charts as a solo artist with classics such as Uncle Albert/Admiral Halsey, Coming Up, Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder, and Say 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 with Michael Jackson. Beyond music, he championed causes from animal rights to poverty relief and music education. Over his career, McCartney has written or co-written 32 Billboard #1 hits, won hits and earned countless honors, including 18 Grammys, an Academy Award, and knighthood in 1997. As of 2024, he remains one of the wealthiest and most respected musicians alive, with an estimated fortune of £1 billion. Paul's journey, shaped by loss, determination, and deep friendships with John Lennon and George Harrison, defined not only his own legacy, but the story of modern music itself. Before exploring George Harrison's part in that story, it's worth revisiting how his own musical path began. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool. The youngest of 4 children, he grew up in a modest home with his parents, Harold and Louise Harrison, his sister Louise, and brothers Harold and Peter. His father worked as a bus conductor and former ship steward, while his mother, of Irish Catholic descent, was a cheerful shop assistant who filled their house with music and laughter. Louise was deeply supportive of her children and quickly noticed that nothing brought George more joy than music. She often sang around the house, her voice echoing through the windows, and even while pregnant with George, she listened to Radio India, believing the soothing sounds of sitars and tablas would calm her unborn child, a detail that seemed almost prophetic. The Harrisons moved from Arnold Grove to Upton Green, Speke, in 1950. George attended Dovedale Primary and later the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, where he struggled to fit in. The school offered music classes, but to his disappointment, no guitars. He later said it was a place that tried to make students frightened. George's early musical inspirations included George Formby, Cab Calloway, Django Reinhardt, and Hoagy Carmichael. But in 1956, everything changed. While riding his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing from a nearby house, a moment that lit a fire in him for rock and roll. From then on, he was obsessed with the guitar, sketching it in his notebooks and dreaming of the day he'd play like his heroes. At 14, George bought his first guitar from a friend, with a little help from his mother, who paid for it. One of his father's friends taught him to play a few simple songs, including Whispering and Sweet Sue. Inspired by the rising skiffle trend, he soon formed his first band, the Rebels, alongside his brother Peter and a friend, Arthur Kelly. Although his father wanted him to finish school, George left at 16 and briefly worked as an apprentice electrician at Blackler's department store. But music was already his true calling. During a small tour of Scotland in 1960, he even performed under the stage name Carl Harrison, a tribute to his rockabilly hero, Carl Perkins. Not long after, George joined John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, where he met Paul McCartney. Together, they became the foundation of what would evolve into the Beatles. In 1960, promoter Alan Williams sent the band to Hamburg, Germany, to perform in gritty nightclubs, an experience that toughened their sound and turned them into a tight live act. George's first stint there ended abruptly when authorities deported him for being underage, but the months in Hamburg proved transformative. When Brian Epstein took over as manager in 1961, he polished their image and helped secure a recording deal with EMI. Their debut single, Love Me Do, reached number 17 on the charts, and by early 1963, Beatlemania had exploded. Quiet and introspective by nature, George soon earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle. It stuck after the band's 1964 trip to the U.S., when a throat infection forced him to save his voice ahead of their now legendary performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. The press quickly noticed George's calm demeanor and short, thoughtful answers during interviews, and the nickname, the Quiet Beatle, soon stuck, a label he accepted with quiet amusement. But George was far more than that. His deep curiosity and sharp musical ear made him the Beatles' unofficial scout for new sounds, especially American soul records. By the time Rubber Soul was released in 1965, his influence was steering the band toward folk rock, inspired by the Byrds and Bob Dylan, and toward Indian classical music after his introduction of the sitar on Norwegian wood. His fascination with Eastern sounds only grew. He played the Swarm and Doll on Strawberry Fields Forever and immersed himself in Indian spirituality. On the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, he included spiritual figures on the cover and contributed his own Indian-inspired track, Within You Without You, which he performed with musicians from the London Asian Music Circle. Reflecting later, George called Sgt. Pepper both a millstone and a milestone, admitting he loved half the songs and couldn't stand the rest. By the late 1960s, Dylan and the band heavily influenced George's outlook on music and collaboration. A visit to Woodstock in 1968 deepened his friendship with Bob Dylan and inspired him to value equality and freedom in creative work, something he felt was missing within the Beatles. Frustrated with limited control, George briefly quit the band on January 10, 1969, before returning 12 days later. When he came back, he stood his ground more than ever, especially against Paul's perfectionism. By the time the Beatles split, George had amassed a treasure of unreleased songs, proof of how much he had grown as a songwriter. His final session with the group took place on January 4, 1970, adding overdubs to Let It Be, marking the quiet end of an extraordinary chapter. But how did Paul McCartney and George Harrison meet? Paul McCartney and George Harrison first met on a bus ride to school. Both attended the Liverpool Institute High School, having passed their entrance exams a year apart. The school was known for its strict academic standards, something George quickly grew to dislike. He later described it as the worst time of my life, recalling the endless rules and lack of creative freedom. Although the school offered a music course, guitars and rock and roll were nowhere to be found. George often spent his lessons daydreaming and sketching guitars in his notebooks, earning a reputation as a troublemaker. Paul, meanwhile, was more disciplined, but shared George's love for the new sound of rock music. Despite their differences, both boys felt out of place in traditional classrooms. The year gap between them meant they didn't socialize much in school, but outside those walls, fate stepped in. They lived in different neighborhoods but rode the same bus into town each morning. He had the same uniform and was going the same way as I was, George later recalled, so I started hanging out with him. George remembered Paul laughing to himself on the bus and thinking, "We've got a real nut on our hands." Still, a shared obsession with music quickly brought them together. Paul had just traded his trumpet for a guitar, and soon the two began exchanging chords, studying song structures, and teaching each other what they learned. Their curiosity even led them across Liverpool to track down a man rumored to know a magical new chord. Paul's natural musical instinct made him the leader of the pair, and by age 15, he had the confidence to join John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. When a spot opened for another guitarist, Paul immediately thought of George. Though John hesitated, thinking George was too young, he eventually agreed to an audition. On the top deck of a late-night bus, George played raunchy flawlessly, impressing them both. On January 21, 1966, George Harrison married model Patty Boyd in a quiet ceremony during the height of Beatlemania. Paul McCartney was the only Beatle present, serving as George's best man and even keeping Boyd's younger brothers entertained during the service. Their easy friendship and humor stood out amid the frenzy surrounding the Beatles' fame. But behind the camaraderie, creative tensions were beginning to build. When the band recorded Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, Paul's leadership and perfectionism started to dominate. George, increasingly drawn to spirituality and Eastern philosophy, felt overlooked. During their 1968 trip to India, while the others discussed music, he reminded them that they were there to meditate, not to plan the next record. Their disagreements deepened when Paul proposed leaving Apple Records and George refused. By the time Abbey Road was released in 1969, George had finally earned the recognition he long deserved, contributing timeless songs like Here Comes the Sun and Something. Even John Lennon admitted Something was the best track on the album. Still, George's frustration over Paul's control lingered. In a later interview, Paul admitted he once told John, "Until now, our songs have been better than George's, but this year, his are at least as good as ours." George brushed it off as patronizing, saying he no longer cared for approval. He would simply write and play on his own terms. In a 1974 interview, George Harrison spoke candidly about his creative differences with Paul. "I'd rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney," he said. "Paul's a great player, but he can be overpowering. I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but not with Paul. Nothing personal, just musical." Despite the tension, their bond ran deep, a mix of rivalry, respect, and brotherhood that never truly faded. Years later, Paul McCartney finally addressed their complex friendship. In a rare interview, he admitted he had underestimated George's songwriting talent. While Paul and John had long been seen as the main creative forces, George quietly delivered timeless songs like "Something," "Here Comes the Sun," and "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." He was a late bloomer, Paul said, but when he got going, wow, he wrote some of the greatest songs ever. Even after the Beatles ended, disagreements resurfaced. In 1994, George, Paul, and Ringo reunited as the Threedles to finish John Lennon's "Free as a Bird." George insisted on bringing in Jeff Lynne as producer and pushed for a softer guitar solo, showing he still knew what he wanted. Yet beneath the creative clashes, there was admiration. George earned the Billboard Century Award in 1992 for his groundbreaking influence on world music, and Rolling Stone later ranked him among the greatest guitarists and songwriters of all time, a legacy both Paul and the world never stopped celebrating. Despite years of creative clashes, George Harrison and Paul McCartney stayed close until the end. George passed away on November 29, 2001, at age 58 after a long battle with cancer. A lifelong smoker, he had also survived a knife attack at his home, Friar Park, just 2 years earlier. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, honoring his deep spiritual beliefs, and he left behind an estate valued near £100 million. Paul later recalled visiting George in a New York hospital during his final days. "We joked about silly things," he said. "It was like we were dreaming. He was my little brother. We held hands. It was lovely." After his passing, Paul told reporters, "He was a lovely guy, a brave man, and had a wonderful sense of humor." A year later, George's friends and family gathered at London's Royal Albert Hall for the Concert for George, organized by Eric Clapton and featuring Paul, Ringo Starr, and the Monty Python cast. Eric Idle described George as one of the few truly good people rock and roll ever produced. Their friendship, built on music, laughter, and quiet affection, endured every storm, and still lives on in the songs that define them both.